Okay, in this second video, I just want to focus on what we're going to do later on this week. These are notes that Dr. Barlatz has produced, which are fantastic, and they give some historical background and then chapter summaries, reading from page 181 to 235. We're going to be filling out this section. So you get a chapter summary here. So you need to read the chapter. This is general remarks, and then you put in your thoughts or questions. So you need to keep this document. I will put it under assignments, and I will check that you are adding in your thoughts, and we'll meet together to discuss these. So chapter 2, what utilitarianism is. Again, you read the summary, having read the chapter, and you put your own thoughts there. Try and put things into your own words. Chapter 3, of the ultimate sanction of the principle of utility, and then you put your thoughts in there. So you really need to engage with this text in some detail, and this is really helpful, concise summary material. Just to go back to a little bit of introduction here. So we have this chapter on CRISP, and I'm just going to go to page 4 of it and carry on where I left off with the first video. So we get this shift between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarians claim that rules are not the chief end of utility, and therefore when rules don't serve the greatest good, the greatest happiness, the greatest number, they then have to be reformed or opposed. And so we should shift back to acts. And so rule utilitarianism collapses into act utilitarianism. Rule utilitarians would say, no, rules are the accumulated wisdom of past experience, and generally you have to have strong reasons to go against them, like the traffic laws or the laws of the state. If everybody starts becoming a judge, jury themselves and deciding their own view on the law moment to moment, then there won't be any law and order in the country. So rules are necessary. They maximize utility. So that's kind of the debate that's going on between rule and act utilitarians. And two problems that arise of this are relativism. There are different rules in different countries. So that would raise problems for rule utilitarianism. Which rules should you follow, and are rules relative? And if rules are relative, then surely that makes act utilitarianism more reasonable. It also raises the question of the tyranny of the majority. So, you know, you could envisage a situation where the majority would be happier if they oppressed the minority. We saw this in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, that the confiscation of Jewish property and businesses and homes was widespread and sanctioned by law. And obviously in a tyrannical state like that's moving towards genocide, we're deeply concerned at how rules can be used to justify the abhorrent. So another example of this would be if you imagine a fictional scenario in, let's say, the South of the southern states of America during the late 19th century or the early 20th century. And we have a racist town in which the results of one act of terrorism, riots and mob violence threaten to lead to many deaths across racially divided lines. Police round up a suspect who's a petty criminal and fits the profile. In court, an act utilitarian may be tempted to bear false witness against the individual, even if they knew them to be innocent. In respect of the terrorism charges, this would lead to an extended prison sentence, but would quell the public violence and allow the police to reassure the public that the situation was under control. A rule utilitarian would object. While the outcome of this particular act may be beneficial to the town's population as a whole, the individuals in a society which followed the rule do not bear witness against innocent people, even in cases in which the result is a greater good. that rule would protect everybody. And I guess living in a state where rules could be dangerous to you, it's in the interest of everybody to have rules that are just and fair. Another claim is that it can lead to rule worship. You know, Dickens said the law is an ass. Sometimes the law can be unbending and unchangeable. And act utilitarians are quite prepared to sort of reform and change the laws, even to break them. But rule utilitarians, strong rule utilitarians, would be very reluctant. You'd need to have an overwhelmingly good reason to jump the red light, or to break the speed limit, or to go against the rule of law. Then there are a whole load of statements here under counter to this. So a counter to this could be that rule utilitarianism is better because it's still better to act under a code of rules than not any rules at all. Here are three common act utilitarian issues. The problem of calculation. Can you really just weigh on one set of scales the polymorphous nature of pleasure? Pleasure, it has many different forms, and it's hard to weigh the interests of one child against another child. You know, parents do this all the time when you're weighing up, let's say one child goes on a school holiday, another child gets music lessons, and they're very conscious of pleasure and pain. How do you weigh up those? The calculation is deeply problematic. How do you weigh up justice versus truth-telling, or promise-keeping versus loyalty? Calculating pleasures and pains is very difficult. Fairness and liberty and rights. Act utilitarianism does not rule out any type of actions as immoral. There are no constraints on pursuing the greatest happiness. If torturing a child produces the greatest happiness, then it's right to torture a child. Suppose a group of child abusers only find and torture abandoned children. Only the child suffers pain. No one else knows about their activities, but they derive a great deal of happiness. So more happiness is produced by torturing the child. I mean, that just seems abhorrent again. And the concern is that if it's just about quantity of pleasure, then a minority could have their interests and their freedoms and rights overridden by the majority. It's the same kind of problem. And the other problem is one of intentions. What about your motives? Mill is going to give a greater place to motives and intentions than Bentham would, because for Bentham, he's an empiricist. He's interested in outcomes and what you can observe, and it's hard to observe people's intentions. Now, a lot of this has to do with this broadening view that Mill is going to bring in of welfare and what it means to flourish, in a wider view of happiness than just pleasure. And this is nicely illustrated, if we just whiz through this, in the problem of the oyster. This is from Crisp's book on Mill, and he raises this wonderful problem of the oyster and Hayden, and he says this: you're a soul in heaven waiting to be allocated a body on earth, and there's a little supply of bodies left. The available ones have dwindled down, but you're given a choice between being Hayden the composer, who has success and honor in his lifetime, and he's cheerful and popular as a character. He's traveled widely and he gains much enjoyment from field sports. Or you can be an oyster, says the angel. And you say, well, obviously I want to be Hayden. And the angel seems a bit annoyed at this point, and he says, I tell you what, we're having trouble getting rid of this oyster, so I'm going to do you a deal. Although it's a mild, sensual pleasure that you'll have as an oyster, a bit like floating drunk in a warm bath, you will have as long as you like. So the duration will be up to infinity for you as an oyster. Whereas if you're Hayden, you're only going to have 77 years on Earth. Now, if you believe, as Bentham does, in commensurability, in other words, all pleasures can be weighed against one another, all pleasures are commensurable, they can be measured against one another, then you are going to say the infinite quantity of pleasure that an oyster could have, however modest, is going to be equivalent to the 77 years of deep fulfillment and higher levels of pleasure that Haydn, the composer, is going to enjoy. Haydn, even at his graduation in 1793, had the university orchestra kind of play, and I think he directed that. So, immensely fulfilling life. How do you weigh those two up against each other? Now, John Stuart Mill is going to say, because there are higher and lower pleasures, pleasures of the mind and pleasures of the body, no amount of the pleasures of a pig satisfied will be equivalent to the dissatisfaction of a human. No amount of the pleasures of a kind of common or garden human are going to be equivalent to the dissatisfaction of a life of Socrates, because they're incommensurate. They can't be weighed on the same set of scales. This is a problem for utilitarianism. And the Haydn and the oyster illustration of Roger Crisp illustrates this quite nicely. David Hume also said there's nothing to privilege the entire extinction of the human race to the scratching of an itch. So sometimes the act utilitarian might come back and say, well, lower pleasures and higher pleasures, Mill kind of takes a view that only through weakness of character would a competent judge choose lower pleasures. But sometimes people are in the mood for theatre, sometimes they're in the mood for watching a football match. Sometimes they're in the mood for reading a great novel. Sometimes they just want a nice meal or some ice cream. So are we always kind of making this distinction between higher and lower pleasures? There's some come and go in the debate there. And there's also a bit of a dilemma here. Now, I've tried to explain this dilemma old school here. I don't know if you can see it. So you can say on the one hand that the quantity collapses. If you have pleasure and pain and you're weighing them all on the scales of utility, and they can all be collapsed onto quantity, that's one horn of the dilemma for Mill. So Mill, you could say, ultimately, he is saying that utility is the measure of all things. You can weigh things on the scale of pleasure and pain. And if everything in the end comes down to a single set of scales that you can weigh pleasure and pain, then he's no different to Bentham. He's really an act utilitarian, or he's a very weak rule utilitarian. Rules are only good insofar as they're useful. Therefore, it all boils down to pleasure and pain in the end. That's the only measure, and he's no different to Bentham. That's one horn of the dilemma. The other horn of the dilemma is to say Mill is not a full hedonist. He has now developed this higher category of intellectual pleasures that are somehow better than physical pleasures. He's emphasized that they can't all be weighed on the same scales. They're incommensurate. They can't be measured together. And they're polymorphous. Higher and lower pleasures are very different. And so Haydn and the oyster raises a big problem for Mill, because if he is innovative and he's saying that it is not just utility of pleasure and pain, but now we're going to evaluate welfare, rules, human flourishing, then it's very different to Benthamite hedonistic utilitarianism. And he's also emphasizing self-realization and noble character. So this is a bit of a dilemma. Either there is just one set of scales of pleasure and pain, and it's all quantitative, and in the end you can boil rules and welfare and all these other aspects of higher pleasures down into utility. What are the outcomes in terms of pleasure and pain? And it is quantifiable. Or you're breaking with Benthamite utilitarianism quite considerably. That's another horn of the dilemma. And you're saying, no, there are higher pleasures and these are just incomparable with lower pleasures. Rules really matter in and of themselves. You need to have immensely strong reasons to break with them, and human flourishing is really important. And this is quite a different beast to Bentham. So there's a sort of dilemma that's featured here that we need to just wrestle with and think a little bit about, and that's on page 7. So I'll just go back to that. It's outlined for you on page 7. This kind of dilemma between higher and lower pleasures there. There's quite a lot on competent judges. Mill has this view that there is some kind of difference between people of education. This is somewhat elitist, that if you've experienced higher and lower pleasures, then you will commit to saying that no amount of the pleasures of a beast are exchangeable for those of a human being. But pleasure is quite subjective. If you take websites like TripAdvisor or Which that are mentioned on page 8 here, then people take a very different view on what constitutes a successful trip, and that can be quite subjective. So how do you judge that? And on this competent judges issue, there are problems as well. Who gets to be a competent judge? You have to be rich, poor, educated, urban, rural, European, African. This often privileges the interests of certain groups in getting to decide. In Mill's day, it was men in Parliament, white men in Parliament, that got to decide how everyone's taxes were spent, how everyone's policies were worked out, and that idea of higher and lower pleasures is problematic. And we might say, when we spend public resources, should we fund opera, art galleries and libraries, or should we fund swimming pools, tennis courts and cookery classes? What are the higher pleasures, what are the lower pleasures, and are they necessary? Now, Mill would recognize that in order to keep your higher pleasures going, you need to take care of your bodily health. So you need to eat well, sleep well, exercise, and these could be seen as lower pleasures, but they're deeply interconnected to higher pleasures. So again, it's complicated. So then he goes on to the proof and sanctions of utilitarianism. And he's saying here that we're looking for a kind of first principle that you come back to. And he's going to argue that the first principle isn't reason, but it's the outcome. And he recognizes here the value of experience and Aristotle's idea of the golden mean, between two extremes, the vice of excess and the vice of deficiency. And he's saying that he's promoting an inductive school of ethics where observation and experience will inform us in our judgments. We won't trust in rationalism or Kantian kind of abstract rules. We'll think in terms of objective observations. He thinks that the first principle of morality is that we should pursue the greatest good of the greatest number, maximize happiness, and he thinks this is a properly basic or a foundational belief, one that doesn't need prior justification, that stands on its own merits. And he summarizes this here in this argument: each person desires his or her own happiness. Just observe people, that's what they do. Desiring something means that it's desirable. Therefore, each person's happiness is desirable. Whatever is desirable is good, so everyone's happiness is good. To it, the general happiness itself must be desirable, as it's made up of a person's happiness. The general happiness is good as it's desirable. Everyone ought to promote what's good. Everyone ought to promote general happiness. The principle of utility says that everyone ought to obey the principle of utility. Now, there are various problems with this. One is equivocation. And what do we mean by good? Now, G. Moore, you'll be familiar with the naturalistic fallacy. He says, if you point to something in nature and you say, this is good, like you say, pleasure is good, pain is bad, then you're saying those two things are equivalent. Goodness equals pleasure. Now, if that were true, those would be synonyms. There wouldn't be an open question, but is pleasure always good? Is pain always bad? Right? If you were just to say good is good, that would be a closed question. Of course, they're the same thing. But if you can ask an open question, is it always good? Is pleasure always good? Sometimes a little suffering is good for us, like when we study hard and we develop our minds, that the pressure of exams might be something that seems painful, but it's good. So if that open question is there, then it can't be the case that pleasure and goodness are exactly the same thing. They're synonyms. There is a slight difference between them. And that is what the naturalistic fallacy is. It's fallacious to point to something and say that is good, because it raises the open question argument. So Crisp argues that Moore fails to hit the target, however, with this criticism. Mill is not trying to define good using the word desire. He's instead pointing out that happiness is good, desirable, an end, and his project is ironically not that dissimilar to Moore. Good are the pleasures of friendship and aesthetic appreciation. John Stuart Mill does seem to imply that what we desire is good, but even then it's perhaps misreading Mill. He accepts that many people do desire things that are good for them, the lower pleasures, but that with education they find themselves drawn away from such pursuits to others. So Mill has great faith in education, that if we roll it out and it becomes widespread, then just like he was a blank slate, every other child is a blank slate, and you can really create transformations in society if education, primary education particularly, becomes widespread. Crisp supports this, as it's clear that the gap between egotistical hedonism and universalistic hedonism is large. So, we all desire our own happiness, but what about the greatest good of the greatest number? What about a global concern about the environment, about refugees, about the inequality in the world? Do we really concern ourselves with that? That's the big problem in ethics, according to Henry Sidgwick, the clash between self-interest and benevolence. That's the biggest question in ethics. Right, the sanctions, we're going to look at sanctions. There are lots of sanctions that are available: external and internal constraints, fear of how others might perceive us, constraints by the law, religious constraints. He's going to look at that. And we're going to go on and look at Mill and justice, chapter 5. So I think the key thing at this stage is to work your way through, this is good background material, but to work your way through these summary documents of Dr. Brown-Latz, and then add in your thoughts on chapter 1, chapter 2, and so on. I'll pop mine up on the posts, and if we can have a conversation about that in a subsequent lesson, that would be great. Do ask if you have any questions, and we will take this forward from there.